Imagine a battlefield long before satellites, long before secure digital radios, long before anyone could even dream of sending a text message. The smoke is thick in the air. Military. Wires have been cut by artillery. Radios are unreliable, heavy, and even easily jammed. Units are isolated in forests, in trenches, in ravines. Messages still need to be moved. Lives still depend on information getting through. And into that world, the U.S. Army turned to a small, unlikely hero, the homing pigeon. For more than half a century, the United States military relied on these birds as a quiet, almost invisible backbone of communication. While history books tend to spotlight generals, tanks, and aircraft, there was another service quietly at work, the Army's Pigeon Service. Let's start at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. During World War I, the Army established a pigeon breeding and training center there. It began modestly, as the Signal Corps looked for reliable ways to move messages from the front lines back to the command post when everything else had failed. Over time, Fort Monmouth became the heart of a heavily organized, highly disciplined pigeon program. Picture long rows of wooden lofts, each filled with carefully bred homing pigeons, soldiers, pigeoneers if you will. Pigeoneers, they are called, tended to these birds like a cross between a farmer's, trainers, and communication specialist. Their job was to create the most reliable living message carriers possible. The process started early. When young pigeons were just a few weeks old, they were moved into their new home, the loft. The loft became everything: food, safety, routine. Pigeoneers fed them at consistent times, used sound cues like rattling feed cans, and created a powerful association in the birds' minds. No matter where they were, you can always come back here. From there, the training escalated. First, the pigeons took short flights across the loft. Then they were taken a mile away and released, then 5 miles away, then 10, and over weeks and months the distance increased. At each step, the pigeons learned, I may leave in a basket, in a vehicle, or even on a train, but I must find my way back home. Some birds were trained to fly at night, which is a remarkable thing to imagine. These pigeons learned to navigate in low light, returning to their homes, their lofts, long after sunset. Others were conditioned to fly in poor weather, across difficult terrain. The goal was simple, but demanding: a bird that would come home no matter what. And by World War II, the scale of this effort was enormous. The Army Pigeon Service involved thousands of birds and thousands of trained professionals. Fort Monmouth oversaw breeding, training, and deployment. At its height, the system included tens of thousands of pigeons and a global network of lofts and trainers. So how did it work in the field? Imagine a frontline unit deep in the enemy territory. They might be carrying a small wicker basket or a wooden basket with several pigeons inside. Each pigeon has a tiny aluminum or plastic container attached to its leg. Inside that container is a narrow strip of paper, the message. When the unit needs to send critical information, enemy positions, requests for artillery support, or even calls for support, urgent calls to stop firing, the commander writes it out, rolls the paper tightly, and tucks it into their tube on the bird's leg. Then the pigeon is released. The bird wheels up into the sky, circles once or twice to get its bearings, and then heads out in the direction in a straight line to its loftily home, maybe 10, 20, 50 miles away. Up there, it still faces danger. Enemy soldiers might fire at it, predatory birds might try to attack it, weather might be tricky, but if it makes it through and it will land on its mark back in the loft, it will trigger a mechanism to alert a soldier and then let that soldier know there's a message on a tiny slip of paper on its leg to be pulled and read to signal to the office. One bird, one message. Sometimes hundreds of lives are at stake. The most famous of these pigeons is a name you may not have heard of, Cher. Now, Cher served the U.S. Army during World War I. It was attached to the 77th Division in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. In 1918, a group of American soldiers, often remembered as the Lost Battalion, found themselves trapped behind the German lines. They were surrounded, taking heavy fire, and worst of all, their own artillery started shelling them by mistake. The artillery units didn't know the battalion's exact location. They thought they were firing on the enemy. The only way to stop this was to get out a message. Several pigeons were released with coordinates and pleas to halt the fire. One after another, the birds were shot down. Finally, the men attached a message to Cher and sent her up in the air. German forces saw her go up and opened fire on her. She was hit. She was badly wounded. She had a shot go through her breast, which then she also had a shot in her eye, and one of her legs was nearly torn off. Yet somehow she kept flying. She traveled nearly 25 miles in that condition, over enemy lines and back to her loft, where she landed. She was barely alive, with a message canister still attached to her wounded leg. On that slip of paper were the coordinates of a trapped battalion and the urgent plea to stop the shelling. Because the message got through, the artillery correctly managed the fire, and many of those surrounding soldiers survived. The Army surgeons saved Cher's life, though she never fully recovered. She became one of the most honored animals in U.S. military history, a symbol of bravery and reliability under impossible conditions. And Cher was not alone. In World War II, other pigeons carried messages that canceled planned bombardments on friendly positions, redirected reinforcements, and relayed intelligence when radios were unreliable or too risky to be used. High honors for their service, recognized officially for acts that, if performed by a human soldier, would easily have garnered them heroic status. The Army did not rely on a single bird for critical communications. For important messages, multiple pigeons might be released with identical slips of paper, increasing the odds that at least one of them would make it through. This built-in redundancy made pigeons a surprisingly robust communications channel, and in an age where wires were easily cut and radios could be lost, broken, or intercepted. On the logistics side, the system was sophisticated. Mobile lofts, essentially pigeon coops on trucks, allowed the Army to move home closer to the front lines as units advanced. These pigeons could be transported in small baskets on jeeps or ships, or even dropped in containers by parachute so that they could be used by the airborne divisions. Training manuals detailed how to care for the birds, how to feed them, how to release them, how to protect them under combat conditions. All of this was overseen by the Signal Corps, treated these pigeons not as pets, but as critical communication equipment, but with feathers. For decades, they served quietly in the background. They carried messages through 2 world wars and other operations, acting as a kind of living, self-navigating courier service. In many cases, they were the last reliable link when every other option had failed. And then technology caught up. By the 1950s, communication had transformed. Radios had improved dramatically. New equipment was more portable, more secure, and more reliable. Other technologies, from better telephones to emerging electronic systems, this reduced the need for feathered messengers. Maintaining pigeons at scale required breeding programs, feeding, housing, and trained professionals to look after them. As the strategic value of the pigeons declined, the cost no longer made sense. So, on March 23rd of 1957, the U.S. Army officially closed its pigeon program and disposed of its last remaining homing pigeons. The loft at Fort Monmouth went quiet. It was an end of an era. A handful of birds, especially those who had distinguished themselves with service records, were preserved and honored. Some ended up in museums, some in memorials, while others continued to be part of a broader history of military communication. So when you think back of the U.S. military history, it is easy to imagine tanks, planes, ships, and sophisticated electronics. And that's all true. There's also another layer. Thousands of small, determined birds trained with patience and care, flying through gunfire and storms, carrying tiny capsules of paper that sometimes meant the difference between disaster and survival. The story of the homing pigeon is a story about ingenuity, about using the natural abilities of animals in highly disciplined, organized ways to solve a life or death situation. It's a story about reliability under pressure, long before digital networks and satellites. And it is a reminder that in the most critical moments, sometimes the message that saves lives does not come over a wire or through a screen, but on the leg of a bird that simply knows how to find its way home.